recent reporting from the Lever, multiple authors, including founder David Sirota, examine how an overarching inflation myth crushed the working class and how corporate media lied about the main source of price increases. Sirota tweeted, "We were told mergers create efficiencies that ultimately reduce prices for consumers. That was a lie. When the resulting oligopolies started jacking up prices, corporate pundits blamed workers' wages and government aid to the poor. That was also a lie." Economics professor Isabella Weber tweeted yesterday, "Are profits a driver of inflation? Considered unreal economics not long ago, more and more evidence is forthcoming, including from central banks. I discussed my unlikely intellectual journey and how sellers' inflation is gaining currency." Joining us now to weigh in on this debate that has been really bubbling on Twitter for the last week or so is senior editor at the Lever, Andrew Perez. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks for having me.
So just to set the stage for folks who haven't been following this, tell me if I'm right about this. There's been a lot of folks on the left who, for some time during the course of the pandemic, have been pointing to greedflation as one of the main drivers of the inflation crisis. In other words, corporations raising prices beyond that which they need to recoup any losses that the supply chain crisis is causing for them. And for a long time, there was a great deal of pushback against that. Now it seems there's a growing consensus that greedflation has played a role. Why do you think there is now a growing consensus, and why are some still digging in their heels and saying that greedflation isn't really real?
Sure. So progressives really have been arguing for, maybe the better part of 2 years now that, ever since inflation started, that corporate profits were playing a really key role, a really key factor here. There were studies really kind of early on in 2021 from the Economic Policy Institute, 2021 and 2022, showing that that corporate profits were making up a disproportionate share of price hikes that people have been experiencing. And there has been a lot of pushback from sort of the Beltway pundit class, some of the sort of like best known economists in Washington, saying that wasn't really a factor. Despite, reams and reams of data showing that it was the case. And what we've seen in the last few weeks has been, we've seen more acceptance of this idea in outlets where we wouldn't have necessarily expected it, like the Wall Street Journal. The chief economist at UBS, the banking giant, said that, we've been living through a wave of profit-led inflation. So there has been a big change here, and we tried to kind of go back to the pundits who had been really arguing against this and see what they had to say for themselves now, and did not really get any satisfying feedback.
So, to listeners who might be thinking, well, companies are supposed to make profit. That's their objective. What's the problem here? How can you tell that the profits that are being earned right now are kind of the bad kind that are causing inflation versus them realizing that they can charge what the market will bear and they're just doing the thing that we've been told since our first economics class companies are supposed to do? Yeah.
I think that really kind of has been one of the pushbacks here is that corporate greed isn't increasing, right? That's a constant. But no, I think, what the data has been telling us all along is that profits are helping drive inflation, a disproportionate share in a way that really hadn't been seen in many decades. In other inflationary crises, you did not have this massive expansion of corporate profits like we've seen. And, even anecdotally, we've all seen that for the last several years, right? It's been report after report for much of the last 2 years about how companies were booking record profits even amid, the COVID-19 pandemic. But, that is the other thing here, right? We've all been living through a pandemic for the last 2 years, or last 3 years. Price gouging in a pandemic is, unacceptable. It's not something we should just say, oh, that's normal corporate behavior, right? There is an end result here that affects people in a really concrete way.
Yeah, it's worth noting that there have been other times in American history and certainly in global history where there have been, laws promulgated to prevent exactly that kind of price gouging during a crisis. we are at a place, I think, in American politics where there is a lot of pushback against the idea that when there is a winner and a loser between consumers and corporations, that the state should ever intercede on the behalf of consumers. There's been, I think, a lot of narrative building successfully by conservatives that say that tinkering with the system in order to benefit the rich, whether it's through tax cuts or other kind of tax advantages that allow people to transfer wealth, et cetera, that sort of thing doesn't get a lot of scrutiny. But if you ever try to re-rig the system in the benefit of the working people, of consumers, of people whose money and labor keeps these companies going, then that is somehow an unfair rigging. A Morning Consult poll published last month found that 35% of voters say maximized corporate profits as a primary driver of inflation are in fact a primary driver of inflation. According to the survey, the electorate is, quote, increasingly likely to blame rising inflation on supply chain issues, while nearly 2 in 3 voters say corporations have enjoyed increased profitability in recent years. Andrew, what kind of evidence do you think voters, consumers are pointing to kind of come to this realization, despite the fact that, as you've mentioned, these mainstream outlets have not been really reporting this out until recently?
Yeah. I mean, I think people probably instinctively kind of understand, when they go to the store and everything is more expensive. So I think that definitely is probably playing a big role. Everyone has seen reports about corporate profits going up for most of the pandemic. But, I think you're right. There's definitely been like this narrative against, any efforts to introduce price controls that could affect supply. But, I mean, on the other hand, what's been happening is the Federal Reserve, in order to combat inflation, has been raising interest rates. And that's the kind of thing that, is designed to drive down worker power, designed to, they want to increase unemployment, drive down wages, with the idea that has been what, is driving inflation, even though we see that's not really the case. So, I mean, I think that kind of shows you the options here. Like, you could either take it out on workers who are already, suffering through a pandemic, who are seeing their wages not keep up with inflation, even with the sort of like, wage increases we've seen in the last few years, they've not kept up with inflation at all. So, it's either you could go after workers who are already suffering, or you could, maybe try to take a bite out of the companies that are actively price gouging in this country right now.
I think it's also worth noting that some of these CEOs have been telling on themselves in earnings calls throughout the pandemic, really bragging about the extent to which they're able to up profits because of the supply chain crisis, kind of holding space for the possibility that it isn't just purely a corporate greed issue. Do you think the fact that we're now coming out of the pandemic, at least in terms of the economic effects with the supply chain issues, and the prices on a number of goods still staying high, is part of what is causing the public and maybe even some of these more institutional outlets to finally admit, okay, we can no longer continue to blame this on a supply chain issue?
Yeah. I mean, I do think that's definitely a big factor here. The UBS study, or the comment from their chief economist, is really interesting, because what he was saying is that companies have been able to raise prices in large part due to the kind of, media environment, the narratives around the pandemic, the idea that like there's this supply chain crisis, it's giving companies, stories that they can spin in order to raise prices far beyond what they need. And yeah, as this sort of like additional factors level off, it becomes much harder to justify the prices that they're charging right now.
Well, I really appreciate you weighing in on this, Andrew.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
We'll have more Rising right after this.